Chapter 3: The Physiology of Diving and Nitrox. This chapter discusses possible harmful things that can result from nitrogen and oxygen overexposure, their prevention, and first aid procedures for breathing gas-related problems. In this chapter, you will learn about nitrogen narcosis, decompression sickness, the physiological effects of low oxygen levels, and the physiological effects of high oxygen levels. By the end of the lesson, you will be able to list the physiological effects of nitrogen in diving, state physiological effects of low oxygen levels, list the physiological effects of high oxygen levels, recite signs and symptoms of oxygen toxicity, and state limits of hyperbaric oxygen exposure. The mechanisms of nitrogen narcosis are imperfectly understood, but they are thought to be similar to that of gases used in general anesthesia for surgical procedures. Narcotic effects are not limited to nitrogen. Any inert gas breathed under pressure can cause narcosis, and the malady is more correctly called inert gas narcosis. Because helium has minimal narcotic potency, it is used as a diluting gas in trimix when diving to depths where nitrogen narcosis becomes a serious concern or incapacitating. The effects of narcosis can be measured at shallower depths, but they become more pronounced when the partial pressure of nitrogen is approaching 4 atmospheres, which is about 39 meters of seawater, or 130 feet of seawater, when breathing air. Symptoms increase when increasing depth. Other factors also affect the degree of narcosis. Anxiety and stress, fatigue, cold, hard work, high carbon dioxide levels in the body, and alcohol have all been shown to enhance narcosis. On the other hand, positive motivation seems to reduce its effects. Some divers report acclimatization following repeated exposures, but studies have shown that any adaptation is largely subjective. Narcosis itself is not the danger, but the impaired judgment, loss of orientation, and reduction in problem-solving capabilities are, and the narked diver is at an increased risk. It may become difficult for a diver to monitor time, depth, and air supply, remember the dive plan, or concentrate on the task at hand. Perhaps the most insidious thing about nitrogen narcosis is that divers may not be aware that they are impaired. At first glance, you might assume that you should be less subject to nitrogen narcosis when diving with nitrox because you have replaced some of the nitrogen with oxygen. However, there is no hard or definitive evidence to support this, and it is safer to assume that there is no appreciable benefit to breathing nitrox. As you will remember from your entry-level scuba course, nitrogen narcosis is easily reversible. An ascent to a shallower depth is all that is required. The symptoms disappear as you ascend. It could also be that the stress or anxiety that you are experiencing at depth is as much due to the psychological factors of being outside your personal comfort envelope. In this case, the obvious solution is also an ascent to a shallower, more comfortable depth. You learned about the basics of decompression sickness, what causes it, its signs and symptoms, how to avoid it, and how it is treated in your entry-level scuba course. A brief review will be useful, and we can now use some of the concepts you learned in earlier chapters of this course. Again, if you want to learn more about decompression theory, the NAUI Master Scuba Diver course will greatly increase your knowledge and understanding. During a dive, our bodies are exposed to increased pressure. While we are underwater, the increased partial pressure of the nitrogen in the air, or gas, we are breathing forces additional nitrogen into solution in the tissues of our body, Henry's law. Passing out of the lungs through the walls of the alveoli, dissolved nitrogen enters the blood and is carried to all parts of our body. There, the pressure gradient between the nitrogen dissolved in our blood and the nitrogen in the surrounding tissues causes dissolved nitrogen to move into the tissues. The greater the pressure, or depth, and the longer we are submerged, The more nitrogen will dissolve in our bodies until eventually the gas tension or partial pressure of the dissolved nitrogen in our tissues reaches equilibrium with the partial pressure of the nitrogen in our breathing mixture at that depth. This may take more or less time depending on many factors, including the type of tissue and the circulation to it. Because nitrogen is metabolically inert, it simply remains in our tissues while we are at depth. When we ascend properly from a dive, the reverse occurs. The partial pressure of nitrogen in our lungs is now reduced to 0.79 atmosphere at the surface, and what is now excess dissolved nitrogen migrates from the areas of higher nitrogen tension tissues and diffuses into the free phase nitrogen within the bloodstream, that is, into nitrogen that is already present as microbubbles. The interplay between the dissolved phase and the free phase bubbles determines the effectiveness of safe nitrogen elimination as well as possible damage to the body. Ideally, the free phase nitrogen is carried via the blood to the lungs where it passes into the alveoli and is exhaled. This elimination occurs over time until the nitrogen tensions in our body's tissues are again in equilibrium with the partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere. This absorption and elimination of nitrogen are termed in-gassing and off-gassing. However, if we dive too deep for too long and then ascend too fast, the pressure gradient between the dissolved nitrogen and the ambient pressure is too great for proper controlled off-gassing, and released nitrogen diffuses into the free phase bubbles within the body. Once the bubbles enlarge and begin to aggregate, they cause mechanical injury and also block the blood flow to tissues, and the trauma presents as decompression sickness. The signs and symptoms of DCS vary greatly depending on the location of the injury and the severity of the case. They can range from simple excessive fatigue to weakness and tingling in the limbs, limb and joint pain and dysfunction, skin rashes and itching, vertigo, loss of sensation, paralysis, and even death. Divers once referred to niggles from the word niggling, meaning troublesome or irritating, mild symptoms of DCS that would probably, or hopefully, resolve themselves and go away over time. But in reality, anyone with a suspected case of DCS should be administered 100% oxygen as immediate first aid, examined by a trained physician, and, if decompression sickness is suspected, receive recompression chamber treatment. If in doubt, treat. Untreated, even the mildest case of decompression sickness may worsen over time, and permanent injury is a more likely outcome. You have probably heard that all dives are decompression dives. This is a truism in that any reduction in pressure is consistent with a literal definition of decompression. Every diver ascending from depth is experiencing decompression in this sense. Divers, however, usually use decompression to mean the controlled reduction of pressure on ascent in order to control bubble growth and prevent decompression sickness. It is the rate of ascent that will determine level of risk with regard to bubble growth in accordance with Boyle's law calculations. As divers, we plan our dives to prevent excessive nitrogen loading during the dive and to control bubble growth on ascent in order to avoid getting bent. To plan dives, we use dive tables or dive computers. Because we reduce the rate of nitrogen uptake when we breathe oxygen-enriched air, special Nitrox dive tables or computers are used for Nitrox diving. We can also use a calculated equivalent air depth with standard air tables. These tools are discussed later in their own chapter. As a responsible diver, you should be mindful of other predisposing factors that are likely to increase susceptibility to DCS. Dehydration, which reduces the efficiency of your circulation, is now believed to be a major contributor to the development of DCS. Divers are well advised to drink plenty of fluids and avoid excessive amounts of diuretic drinks, such as coffee, caffeinated soft drinks, and alcohol, which can contribute to dehydration instead of preventing it. During diving, heavy exercise will increase circulation to the exercised parts and speed up in-gassing. After diving, exercise can increase likelihood of bubble formation, while resting and relaxing will give the body better opportunity to off-gas properly. General physical fitness is also beneficial because it promotes more efficient muscle use and blood flow. A person's general circulation becomes less efficient with increasing age, and therefore older divers are advised to dive more conservatively. In your beginning scuba course, your instructor probably said, at extreme depths, even the oxygen in the air you breathe can become toxic, but this only happens at depths far greater than recreational limits, so don't worry about it. End of subject. Now you are learning to dive with oxygen-enriched air, and oxygen toxicity and oxygen safety are very real concerns. Oxygen is vital to our being. It is our essential life support element. Inhaled oxygen is metabolized in our tissues, producing the energy necessary to sustain life. If we are deprived of oxygen, our survival time is measured in just minutes. Still, our bodies operate well only within a rather narrow range of oxygen partial pressures. Too high an oxygen level can be just as harmful as too low. Moreover, because oxygen is so highly reactive, supporting combustion and combining aggressively with many substances, special care and precautions are required when handling pure oxygen or gas mixtures that are high in oxygen concentration. A later chapter of this course is devoted to oxygen handling and equipment considerations. Oxygen is our life support gas, the gas we extract from air in respiration and use in metabolism to generate heat and energy. It is absorbed through our lungs, combined with the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, and delivered to the tissues via the arterial system. There it is metabolized to produce our life-maintaining energy. The primary waste product is carbon dioxide, which, dissolved in the serum of our blood, is delivered back to the lungs via the venous side of the circulatory system and exhaled. Our bodies are optimized to operate at greatest efficiency when the oxygen partial pressure approximates that of standard sea level air, 0.21 atmospheres absolute. People who live at altitude do become acclimated to lower oxygen levels by increasing the number of red blood cells in their bodies and other changes. But if the partial pressure of oxygen falls too low, the oxygen supply is inadequate to the task of fully supporting us. The symptoms of hypoxia, which means low oxygen, begin to appear. The brain, which requires large amounts of energy, is among the first to suffer. Manifestations of hypoxia include impaired mental performance and defective memory, blueness of the lips, cyanosis, fatigue, visual disturbances, and dizziness. For most persons, symptoms begin to appear if the partial pressure of inspired oxygen falls below about 0.16 atmospheres. If the partial pressure of inspired oxygen falls below about 0.10 atmospheres, more severe symptoms leading to unconsciousness will occur. Because the breathing stimulus is largely controlled by carbon dioxide levels rather than oxygen levels, a hypoxic diver rarely feels any warning of impending loss of consciousness. Hypoxia is not a problem for divers breathing either air or oxygen-enriched air, but it must be monitored in some rebreather situations or deep diving applications. Extremely deep dives may require low percentages of oxygen in the bottom mix, the breathing gas used at depth, and mistakenly breathing the bottom mix at shallow depth can lead to hypoxia. Although extremely rare, only one reported event since accident records have been kept, hypoxia has also occurred from internal rusting of a steel cylinder stored over many months with some water inside, which supported additional rusting that consumed the oxygen in the stored air. Oxygen is essential to us, and it also plays an important role in the treatment of diving maladies such as decompression sickness. Divers planning staged decompression dives will breathe high concentrations of oxygen during decompression stops in order to off-gas nitrogen more quickly, but safely. As Nitrox divers, we We use oxygen-enriched air to safely prolong our dive time or to increase our nitrogen safety margins. However, because we are utilizing an oxygen-enriched mixture, we must control and monitor the inspired partial pressure of oxygen we are breathing, as well as pay attention to the other parts of dive planning. If we did not do so, we could easily get into trouble by diving to depths that allow the oxygen partial pressure in our breathing gas to become dangerously high. With oxygen and nitrox, it is entirely possible to get too much of a good thing. There are two types of oxygen toxicity. Central nervous system toxicity has a wide range of signs and symptoms, the most dramatic being epilepsy-like convulsions. CNS toxicity can result from relatively short exposures to high partial pressures of oxygen. The other type is called pulmonary toxicity or whole body toxicity. Pulmonary toxicity results from prolonged exposure to elevated partial pressures of oxygen above about 0.5 atmosphere. As the name implies, its most pronounced effects are on the lungs, producing signs and symptoms such as chest tightness, breathing discomfort and pain, shortness of breath, and coughing. Development of pulmonary toxicity requires long-term exposures such as those encountered in saturation diving, certain military and commercial diving, or recompression chamber treatment. Pulmonary toxicity is not a concern of the recreational nitrox diver. CNS toxicity is a concern. For recreational nitrox diving, the generally accepted PO2 exposure limit is 1.4 atmospheres absolute, with 1.6 atmospheres absolute reserved for contingencies. 1.4 atmospheres absolute PO2 is more than adequate for almost all of the dives you may want to accomplish. Susceptibility to CNS oxygen toxicity varies greatly between individuals and is affected by other factors and conditions as well. One's oxygen tolerance has also been shown to vary from day to day. It is impossible to predictably relate CNS oxygen toxicity appearance to any definite PO2 and time exposure. Nevertheless, it is certain that the greater the oxygen partial pressure and the longer the time of exposure, the more likely it is that symptoms of CNS toxicity will develop. In setting oxygen exposure limits, it is best to err on the side of safety. Beginning with its first presentation of oxygen-enriched air for scuba diving in the second edition of the NOAA Diving Manual, 1979, NOAA has recommended a maximum oxygen partial pressure of 1.6 ATA. In the new fourth edition, 2001, they add the cautionary comment: a slightly lower level provides less oxygen exposure risk. Diving to a PO2 higher than 1.6 ATA has been likened to knocking on the door of a casino. Once you go in, you could win, or you could lose a little, or you could lose a lot. But in the long run, the house always wins. For recreational nitrox diving, the generally accepted PO2 exposure limit is 1.4 atmospheres absolute, with 1.6 ATA reserved for contingencies. Among the many factors that can increase your susceptibility to CNS oxygen toxicity are heavy exercise, increased carbon dioxide buildup from whatever cause, chilling or hypothermia, and water immersion. One cannot predict oxygen toxicity. It is also impossible to predict a reliable sequence of toxicity signs and symptoms. The first noticeable sign may be the epilepsy-like convulsions. This may not be serious in itself, but it is most certainly a problem if it occurs at a depth of 30 meters or 100 feet while breathing out of a scuba regulator. Drowning is a very likely result. Many preliminary manifestations of CNS oxygen toxicity have been reported, either singly or in combination. The mnemonic acronym CONVENTED is useful for remembering the most obvious of them. CONVENTED stands for convulsions, visual disturbances, ears, nausea, twitching or tingling, irritability, and dizziness or dyspnea. Convulsions are the most obvious and most serious signs. Possible precursors to convulsions are visual disturbances, tunnel vision, dazzle or seeing fireflies, ear ringing, tinnitus, or sounds like an approaching train in a tunnel, nausea, including vomiting, twitching, especially of the lips and small facial muscles or the hands, or tingling, paresthesia, especially in the fingers, irritability, restlessness, euphoria, dysphoria, uneasiness or feelings of impending doom, anxiety or general confusion, dizziness and vertigo or dyspnea, difficult or labored breathing, and other signs can include facial pallor, slowed heart rate, bradycardia, pupil dilation, hiccups, and hallucinations. Appearance of any sign or symptom of oxygen toxicity is reason to terminate the dive, but because precursor symptoms are highly variable as well as subjective, and they may not occur, it is doubly important that divers keep their PO2 exposure within an acceptable limit. In one study, convulsions were the first noticed manifestation in 40% of the subjects studied. In another study, nausea was the most common first manifestation, followed by muscular twitching and vertigo. If a convulsion were to occur underwater, there is little that can be done until the active phase of the seizure is over and the muscles relax. Muscle contraction may cause the diver to lose the regulator, but the victim also ceases to breathe during the active phase as the vigorous, uncontrolled muscle contractions interrupt breathing and the tongue blocks the airway. No attempt should be made to surface victims of an oxtox hit at this time because they are effectively holding their breath. Because the convulsion was precipitated by breathing a high partial pressure of oxygen and oxygen tensions in the body are therefore high, the person remains well oxygenated during the convulsion and hypoxia is not a problem. Carbon dioxide levels will also become very high because the muscles are exercising heavily while the victim is not breathing. When the post-convulsive resting phase begins, the muscles relax and the victim remains unconscious. At this point, the victim can be taken to the surface and first aid care begun. The best way to avoid oxygen toxicity problems is to stay within correct oxygen exposure limits. As stated above, the generally accepted limit for diving is 1.4 ATA PO2, with 1.6 ATA PO2 as a contingency. These limits are not lines drawn with a sword in the sand. Many divers have dived to 200 feet or 61 meters, and even considerably deeper on air, and most have returned none the worse for wear. But prudence should be part of all dive planning, and if you have reason to dive beyond recreational limits, you should definitely be preparing for and taking a NAUI trimix training course, as well as one in decompression techniques. In deep diving, trimix reduces not only your oxygen exposure, but also your nitrogen exposure. If you want to safely dive deep, and remember what you saw and did down there, try trimix. The oxygen exposure limits described in this course carry an extremely low risk of oxygen toxicity. They are well below any levels that might reasonably be expected to cause problems. In addition to a general PO2 limit, NOAA, in the third edition of its diving manual, introduced oxygen exposure time limits for a range of oxygen partial pressures from 0.6 ATA to 1.6 ATA. See Table 3.1. The table shows allowable time for a single dive at any PO2, as well as the maximum accumulated exposure time over any 24-hour period. For example, for a PO2 of 1.0 ATA, equivalent to 38 meters or 124 feet on air, the maximum dive time for a single dive is 300 minutes, and is the same for any 24-hour period. For a PO2 of 1.4 ATA, 33 meters or 111 feet on Nitrox 32, the time limit for a single dive is 150 minutes, and 180 minutes in any 24-hour period. In all cases, a recreational nitrox diver's single dive time will be limited by the no decompression limits as well as the diver's gas supply. These will be less than the NOAA single dive oxygen exposure limit, and the controlling limit, if it arises at all, would be the 24-hour oxygen exposure limit. Even then, only the most dedicated and determined nitrox diver would possibly exceed the 24-hour limit. A diver using Nitrox 36 and diving to the maximum dive times allowed by the NAUI Nitrox 36 dive tables would have to perform 7 square profile dives to 27 meters or 90 feet with a dive time of 50 minutes for the first dive and 24 minutes for each repetitive dive with a minimum surface interval of 2 hours 39 minutes between each dive. CNS toxicity is avoided by abiding by easily managed limits. Avoid excessive oxygen partial pressures. Remember that the recommended maximum PO2 for recreational nitrox diving is 1.4 atmospheres, with a PO2 of 1.6 atmospheres as a contingency amount. Plan your dives and choose a nitrox mix that is appropriate to the dive. In the next chapter, you will learn how to find the maximum operating depth for any given enriched air nitrox mixture, as well as how to determine the optimal mix when you know the planned depth of the dive. Planning and conducting safe nitrox dives must include controlling the physiological effects of nitrox. This chapter covered narcosis, decompression sickness, physiological effects of low oxygen levels, and physiological effects of high oxygen levels. Now that you are familiar with the physiology of diving and nitrox, you should be able to list the physiological effects of nitrogen in diving, state physiological effects of low oxygen levels, list the physiological effects of high oxygen levels, recite signs and symptoms of oxygen toxicity, and state limits of hyperbaric oxygen exposure.